I did not grow up in a church that observed Lent or kind of focused on it. I don't think this church has traditionally focused on Lent, but Lent was a time that kind of came about over the course of church history to kind of remember what Jesus did after being baptized and going off and fasting for 40 days. And so Lent was kind of an opportunity for Christians to kind of follow in Jesus' steps. Now, though Lent developed over the course of church history, fasting has always been a part of historic Christian practices, as well as reaching back into Jewish history. Now, as I said, growing up, I did not observe Lent. I didn't kind of take on that. However, fasting was something that I was taught and encouraged to make a part of my regular practice, my regular life in some way. Now, I was taught that, and admittedly, I have not really made it a routine practice or part of something that I consistently do, though I've been trying to make fasting a more part of my life. And when I was a student, we had different opportunities to fast together, to give up food for either 24 or 30 hours were kind of the timelines that we did, and to raise money for those around the world who were experiencing food insecurities, for those in need, and as well as taking time to pray for them. And if I'm honest, though, during those times of fasting, I was more focused on the all-nighters that came with them, and the games that we would play, and just being able to hang out with friends and have a good time. And over the night, especially you get to that 3, 4, 5 a.m. mark, and your stomach is rumbling, the focus began to shift towards, I can't wait for that breakfast that we would all eat to end the fast. And to be honest, a part of that was because I kind of didn't understand it all. I mean, what's the point of not eating when there's perfectly good food available? Like, why can't you just eat as well as pray? Why can't you eat and do raise money? Why do people need me to not eat in order to give money to those in need? What's the point of it all? And so those were opportunities for me not only to be introduced to the practice that Jesus and his disciples took part in, and an ancient practice, but to challenge my heart, my mind, and my body. And so over the years, I've learned more. Okay, what is the value of fasting? And let's be honest. How many of you really want to give up delicious food or fun things? Right? Like, we don't naturally, it does not sound like something that's a lot of fun, which is why when I was a teenager, they had to partner it with games and activities and staying up later than my parents would typically let me, right? Like, how do you get a bunch of students to not eat and to, like, hey, let's fast together? And yet, I think to a degree we realize that when we give up something that has become commonplace in our lives. It makes us check our hearts. It makes us think. And clearly it affects our bodies. Think of a time when you gave up something that had become routinely part of your life. Think of a time that maybe it was forced upon you. And if you can't think of a time, well, I encourage you to think of 5 years ago when we were all forced to give up regular routines. Though we weren't forced to give up food necessarily, as we gave up access to services, fun activities, and non-digital entertainment, some of us schooling, we gave up in-person schooling. It forced us to reevaluate, okay, what do I really value? When we have something taken away from us, or when we give up something, it forces us to answer a question. Well, what now? What now? And we either want to fight to get it back, or we replace it with something else. And so fasting is choosing to voluntarily give up something. In the Bible, it was eating or drinking for a period of time. Not to experience that what now moment, but with a goal to get something done. And as we continue our series of yokes, the yoke's on you, I'm going to challenge you this morning to take up the yoke of fasting. To work on your heart, your mind, and your body. Now, when I started preparing this series, when I was thinking I want to do a series on yokes and kind of centered around Jesus is saying, take my yoke upon you, I did not have in mind fasting. And yet, I came across a verse in Isaiah 58 that challenges us to really hone in on the purpose of fasting. And this morning I actually opened the service with Isaiah 58:11, and we're going to read the verses before that in just a moment. Now fasting in today's world, if you were to talk to someone about fasting, you might get a response of or ask them what fasting means to them. They would kind of tell you, well, maybe going without food for a short time, and maybe it paired with kind of a diet plan, intermittent fasting. I've kind of done that. But I heard one of you say, and it was pretty accurate, that fasting without prayer is just a diet. And while intermittent fasting has seemingly become a bit popular, it's really not the type of fasting that the Bible talks about. However, fasting is also not just necessarily about praying, though prayer is an important part. We're going to read Isaiah 58, and we're going to start verses 1 to 3. As Isaiah kind of points out that fasting is supposed to be something so much more. Isaiah 58, Isaiah says, "Shout it loud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion and to the descendants of Jacob their sins." Starts off pretty glum. Verse 2, "For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions and seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they said, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? Now it starts off, you expect some pretty harsh judgment, and yet the thing that seemingly comes up is, well, it looks like they're seeking after God. They're even fasting, and it looks like they're pursuing God. And I bet you they were fasting a lot more than I ever have. And there's a part of me that kind of looks at them and says, I kind of feel for you. Like, God, why haven't you seen what we're doing? Why haven't you acknowledged us? Sometimes we take on these routines, or I'm going to do this, and I expect God to do something. I'm gonna pray for this, and God's going to do something. Or I'm going to fast maybe, and I expect that God acts the way I think He should. And sometimes we get to the end of those times and we just feel empty. God, where were you? Why didn't I notice you? What was the point of all this? And that kind of bled into my thinking of what's the purpose of fasting? Why fast? Why not just let God do His thing? Yet we see the problem wasn't that people were fasting. The problem wasn't the fasting or God. It was the people. See, verse 3 continues, and we're going to read verse 3 to verse 5. Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast, a day acceptable to the Lord? And this is the verse that caught my attention. Is this not the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go out before you, and the glory of God, of the Lord, will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and He will say, "Here I am," if you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk. Now you might be thinking that, how do you get the yoke of fasting from verse 6 when it talks about breaking the yoke? Well, in choosing to fast, I kind of liken it to taking on a good yoke, to pursue the work that God desires, to break the wrongful yokes that people experience. Because fasting does get work done. And first, it will work on your heart. See, Isaiah in 58 verse 6, it talks, fasting loose the chains of injustice. And that first needs to start with our heart. See, when we see injustice, we might think we want to change it, fix it, destroy it. Yet, when we have seen that throughout history, whatever we do with it, whatever we change it with our own solutions, without God, we will only replace injustice with a different type of injustice. A group of people trying to overthrow oppressive regimes simply go and oppress a different group of people. See, fasting isn't meant to get to that point of, well, now what? And then replace the desire of food with just another selfish desire. Fasting is choosing to say, God, I'm setting this desire aside. This need even. I'm setting it aside because I recognize that you are what I need. You are what this world needs. See, fasting pushes us first to check our own hearts. The first time that we read of someone fasting in Scripture, this actually came up in our small group, and I didn't have the answer, and I quick did a search, and the first time I noticed the word fast was in Kings, but the first time we see someone fast is Moses, when he meets with God and receives his instruction. In Exodus chapter 34, verse 28, Moses was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights without eating bread or drinking water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments. See, we see this moment of Moses communing with God, denying his body, and saying, God, you are what I truly need. Now, we see Jesus become the fulfillment of the law. So we are now invited to fast to allow God to write upon our hearts His desires. Jeremiah 31, verse 33 says, "This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." Fasting is an opportunity to replace filling your stomach with time with God, to allow Him to work on your heart and move your desires for temporary things to eternal things. And the yoke of fasting also works on your mind. It works on your mind to help untie the cords of the yoke. I put in brackets the wrong yoke. See, when the weakness sets in, the mind starts going fuzzy. When the stomach starts to grumble and complain, maybe you felt that, the ache of, I need something to eat. See, we are challenged to let Jesus untie the yoke of anxiety, of fear, and anger. See, when you give up food or something that has become a habit, where does your mind tend to dwell? Where does your mind go when you give up something that has been so routine? It goes to the thing you've given up. Come lunchtime, you're thinking about, ooh, I could really go for something. You could go for a sandwich, a burger, some soup, piece of pizza. Especially when you've decided, you know what, I'm going to give it up. I mean, that's the challenge with giving up addictions. You're constantly thinking about it. It's become so ingrained as a part of your life. And so part of fasting is saying, when my mind begins to think of that thing that I'm giving up, God, help me redirect my thoughts and focus them on you. Focus on your desires, on what you want to do. In those moments, saying, I'm not going to let my mind dwell and focus on the thing that I'm lacking. I'm coming to you, God, for something more important that's on my heart. And then that becomes kind of a great reminder. You get another hunger, tummy starts to rumble. Well, it's time to pray. You start to think about, I'd like to do that. I'd like to eat that. No, you know what? God, how can I be a part of what you want to do? Not to think about a snack, but to talk with God. You know, I've personally found that when I am physically hungry, completely exhausted and tired, yes, I have those moments where I can feel grouchy and just want to fix it with a coffee or food or a nap. And sometimes that's good. And yet when I have been fully exhausted and turn to God, I'm more readily to say, okay, God, I've got nothing. What do you have for me? I have found greater fullness and communion with the Father. See, Jesus knew what he was saying when he repeated the words of Scripture. Matthew records it in chapter 4, verse 4. Jesus, when he was fasting, answered the devil when he was tempted to just turn a stone to bread. You feed yourself. You're God, aren't you? Jesus answered, it is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. See, fasting is a challenge to work the mind and let God untie things that bind our minds and our focus, that we might be free to hear God clearer. The yoke of fasting, though, isn't just about the heart and the mind. It, of course, works our body. That's almost primarily where we feel it. Not consuming food presents bodily challenges, and you feel it. But Isaiah also wasn't just in what he shared, what he spoke to the people on. It wasn't just about do this for your own body. See, he challenged people to live out what fasting was meant to be. It was a challenge to use their bodies in a way that honored God. Fasting is in part a challenge to be empty of ourselves, not to make ourselves more spiritual or get what we want, but to live in a way that, okay, God, I want to live today focused on you and doing what you've called me to do. See, if fasting is left as a personal exercise to try and convince God to bend to our will, it misses the point completely. It's for us to bend to His will. See, in Isaiah's day, people were acting as though fasting exempted them from living in a way that God called them to live. So you could say, you know what, I'm going to fast for 40 days. I'm going to fast for 3 days. I'm going to give up I'm going to give up maybe chocolate milk, or I'm going to give up coffee, or I'm going to give up food for a few days, or I'm going to give up entertainment. But if you then go and treat people terribly, you're missing the point. Isaiah 58:3 says, "Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please and exploit all your workers." In Jesus' day, there was a similar issue. Fasting was used as this way to show others how impressively spiritual they were. Maybe they weren't treating people in the same way, but fasting was this thing like, look at me. And Jesus had some direct words for those people. Matthew 6, verse 16 to 18. "When you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly I tell you, they have received their full reward. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you." If you choose to fast, don't do it to lose weight and look better. Don't do it to look more spiritual. Don't do it to try and say, "Okay, God, I'm doing this so you'll do this." Don't fast to convince God that you're right. See, fasting is an invitation for God to work in and through us as much, as He's at work in our world. Whatever you decide to pray about, invite God to work in you as much as what you are praying about. Maybe what you're praying about, God says, "Okay, I want you to do something about it." Where can you be a part of setting the oppressed free? Where can you take the active role in serving? What are you doing with the food you haven't eaten? How is God challenging you to live in a way that reflects what you desire Him to do? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help and He will say, "Here I am." If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk. How can you take on the yoke of fasting to break the yokes of oppression others are wearing? Music team can come forward for our closing song shortly. I told you I was going to challenge you to take on the yoke of fasting. Now, to be clear, fasting is not going to make you any more part of God's kingdom. Fasting cannot do what Jesus did for you. And yet, it is an opportunity for us to say, God, I want to know you more. I want to have you more involved in my life and in our world. To say, God, I know that when I feel hungry, you're truly all I need. Now I understand some of you might be thinking, well, I can't give up food for this or that reason. But there are different ways that that you can say, you know what? God, I want to set this thing aside to pursue you. So do we do Lent? Is that what I'm encouraging you to do? Are we going to plan every so often? Today's the day. You know what? There might be times. Last month we were asked to participate in choosing a day to fast and pray on behalf of our global workers. But I am not pushing you to say, well, this is how you, or when you got to do it, how you got to do it, for how long. I don't think that's what I'm necessarily called to do. I might invite you to join in something. But it's something, fasting is something we willingly can take up and say, God, I want to be a part of your work. Lent can be helpful. Times when we are challenged to do it together can be helpful. It will work your heart, your mind, and your body. Especially when you do it focused on God and what He is doing. And let's seek to break those yokes of oppression in our families, in our world, in our community, through prayer and through living in a way that represents Jesus. Let's sing together.